There was a composer who heard symphonies in everything, the percussion of rain on different rooftops, the harmony between train whistles and construction sites, the counterpoint of conversations overlapping in cafes. Her mind translated the world into music so complex that when she finally wrote it down, no orchestra could play it. The conductors would look at her scores and shake their heads. Too many layers, they'd say. The audience won't understand. So she simplified, reduced, stripped away the subtleties until her symphonies sounded like everyone else's. She got a job writing commercial jingles, 30 seconds to sell detergent, 4 notes to make people crave hamburgers. Her colleagues called her gifted. They didn't know that each jingle was a massacre, a symphony murdered and compressed into a ringtone. At home, she kept her real compositions in a locked drawer, thousands of pages that would never be performed. Sometimes, late at night, she'd spread them across her floor like a map of an undiscovered country. One evening, she attended a concert of her simplified work. The audience loved it. They called it accessible and moving. During the standing ovation, she noticed something horrifying. They were clapping off beat. Not just a few, all of them. The entire auditorium thundering approval in the wrong rhythm. She realized then that they hadn't heard her music at all. They'd heard what they expected to hear, what they'd been trained to recognize as good music. Her simplifications hadn't made her work accessible. They'd made it invisible. She left during the encore and walked to the river. There, she met an old homeless man playing a damaged violin with only 2 strings. His music was harsh, discordant, wrong by every conventional measure, but it was real. It was his. She sat beside him and listened until dawn, understanding finally what Schopenhauer meant. Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. After that night, she stopped composing altogether. Instead, she began collecting sounds, pure, unprocessed, honest sounds. The whistle of a kettle boiling over, the specific silence between heartbeats, the sound of her own breathing in an empty room. She recorded thousands of hours, creating an archive of truth that no one would ever hear but her. Her apartment became a museum of authentic noise in a world that preferred its music pre-digested. Listen closely to what they applaud, and you'll hear exactly what they cannot hear. The phenomenon has a name in psychology, the Dunning-Kruger effect meeting its inverse, where competence becomes a prison because you're aware enough to see the incompetence being rewarded around you. But Schopenhauer saw deeper. He recognized that intelligence doesn't just reveal the world's stupidity. It reveals the impossibility of sharing what you see. You become a translator, working in a language that doesn't exist yet, speaking to people who are proud of their inability to learn it. Years later, they found her body surrounded by those recordings, each one labeled with timestamps and coordinates, as if she'd been mapping an invisible geography. The obituary called her a local music teacher. At her funeral, they played one of her commercial jingles. Everyone hummed along, getting the melody slightly wrong, which was exactly right. You're standing in a hall of mirrors, but every reflection shows you getting smaller. Are the mirrors lying, or are you actually shrinking? Marcus was a professor of philosophy who could deconstruct any argument, dissolve any certainty, reveal the logical fallacy in any position. His students initially loved him. He made them feel smart, showing them how to spot the errors in everything from political speeches to personal beliefs. But slowly, they began to notice something unsettling. He could destroy any idea, but he never built anything in its place. His brilliance was purely negative, a black hole that consumed meaning without creating any. His office was peculiar, every wall covered in mirrors, each one slightly warped. To remind myself, he'd say cryptically, that every perspective distorts. Visitors would leave disoriented, having seen themselves from angles they'd never considered, none of them flattering. He collected these mirrors obsessively, spending his salary on antique looking glasses that showed reality incorrectly. But who decides what correct looks like? The transformation happened gradually. First, he stopped believing in love, just chemistry and evolutionary imperatives. Then friendship, merely reciprocal altruism. Beauty became symmetry. Courage became risk miscalculation. Wisdom became pattern recognition in a patternless universe. Each insight made him smaller in his own mirrors, watching himself shrink from philosopher to critic to cynical observer to ghost. One day, a student challenged him. If nothing means anything, why do you keep teaching? He stood before his wall of mirrors, seeing himself fractured into 1,000 angles, and realized he taught because destroying meaning had become his meaning. He was a museum curator in a museum of nothing, giving tours of emptiness to people who paid to feel sophisticated about their nihilism. The mirrors hadn't been showing him getting smaller, they'd been showing him disappearing, one belief at a time. That night, he smashed every mirror in his office, not in anger, but methodically, carefully, like a surgeon removing tumors. With each breaking glass, he felt something return, not answers, but the possibility of questions that weren't designed to destroy. In the morning, his students found him sitting in an office full of glittering shards, each fragment reflecting a different piece of the sunrise. Today, he announced, we're going to learn how to build. But here's what Schopenhauer knew that Marcus was just discovering. Intelligence that only deconstructs becomes a self-eating serpent. The mind that sees through everything eventually sees through itself, leaving nothing but the seeing, pure, empty, terrifying awareness without object or subject. The term is semantic satiation, pushed to existential extremes when you analyze meaning so thoroughly that meaning itself dissolves. Every intelligent person faces this moment when understanding comes synonymous with emptiness, when knowledge feels like loss rather than gain. The sharpest blade eventually cuts its own handle. Marcus continued teaching, but differently. He still showed students how to spot logical fallacies, but now he also taught them how to build provisional truths, temporary meanings, necessary fictions. His office remained empty of mirrors. Sometimes students would ask why, and he'd respond, because I finally learned the difference between seeing clearly and seeing through everything until nothing remains. He kept one piece of broken mirror in his desk drawer. Sometimes he'd hold it up to catch the light, watching it fragment into rainbows. Light broken, but not destroyed, scattered, but not lost. It reminded him that intelligence without construction is just elaborate demolition, and that the smartest thing might be knowing when to stop being smart. She drew perfect maps of places that no longer existed. Every street was accurate, every building precisely placed. The only problem, following them, led nowhere. There was a woman who remembered everything, not photographically, but emotionally. She could recall the exact texture of disappointment from a birthday party when she was 7, the specific weight of grief from her grandmother's funeral, the precise temperature of rage from every betrayal. Her memory was a museum of wounds, each one perfectly preserved, labeled, cataloged. She worked as a city planner, drawing blueprints for futures that would never arrive. Her desk was covered with maps, not of the city as it was, but as it had been. The bakery that closed in 1987, the park that was paved over for condos, the tree where she had her first kiss, now a parking meter. She drew them all with obsessive accuracy, creating an atlas of absences. Her colleagues thought she was nostalgic. They didn't understand she wasn't trying to preserve the past. She was documenting destruction. Each map was evidence that everything you love will be demolished, renovated, forgotten. She'd overlay them sometimes, the city of 1960 onto 1980, onto 2000, onto now, watching neighborhoods dissolve like sugar in rain. The only constant was change, and change was always loss disguised as progress. She began to see the same pattern in people. Everyone was a palimpsest, new selves written over old ones, but the previous versions still visible if you knew how to look. Her ex-husband was three people: the man who'd proposed under stars, the stranger who'd grown cold, the ghost who signed divorce papers. All three existed simultaneously in her maps. She'd draw him at different coordinates, depending on which version she was remembering. Do you understand what I'm showing you? Every person you know is already gone, replaced by someone who looks similar but isn't the same. One night, working late, she discovered something terrifying in her maps. The empty spaces were growing. Not just buildings, but entire blocks were becoming void, white spaces where memory should be. She was forgetting, but not normally, selectively. Her mind was erasing the present to preserve the past. She could describe in perfect detail a restaurant from 1995, but couldn't remember what she'd eaten for lunch. She went to a neurologist who found nothing wrong. Your brain is healthy, he said. Perhaps too healthy. It's refusing to overwrite old data with new. She laughed, a bitter sound, like paper tearing. Of course, her intelligence had found a way to malfunction perfectly, to break in the most logical way possible. The condition is called hyperthymesia, when it's perfect recall. But what she had was worse. Selective hyperthymesia, focused only on loss. Schopenhauer would have recognized it immediately. The intellect becoming so acute, it can't stop perceiving absence, mapping not what is, but what's missing. She quit her job and became something else, a grief cartographer, helping people map their losses. Parents of missing children, widows, refugees. She'd draw their vanished worlds with the same obsessive precision, creating atlases of absence that somehow made the loss bearable by making it visible. Her office walls were covered with these maps of nowhere, each one a perfect representation of something that would never exist again. The truest map shows not where you are, but where you can never return. In her final map, she drew herself, not as she was, but as all the selves she'd been, layered like transparencies. The child who believed in justice, the student who thought knowledge meant wisdom, the woman who'd believed love lasted. All of them occupied the same coordinates, but different dimensions, ghost selves haunting the present tense. She realized then what Schopenhauer meant. Consciousness is the ability to perceive loss in advance, to see the ruin in the building while it's still being built. She posted the map on her wall with a note. This is what intelligence looks like. Knowing every beautiful thing is already broken. You just can't see the cracks yet. Listen. That pause between words, she could hear entire conversations in it. The problem was, they were always arguments. Dr. Sarah Chin had trained herself to hear what wasn't said. As a therapist, she'd learned that truth lived in pauses, in the space between words where people decided what to hide. She could read a marriage in the gap between I love and you, diagnose depression in the rhythm of breathing. Here lies, in the specific quality of silence that followed questions. Her patients called her gifted. They didn't know it was killing her. The ability had started as professional development, learning to read micro-expressions, studying the psychology of deception, understanding the architecture of denial. But intelligence, once sharpened, doesn't stop cutting just because you've left the office. She began hearing the silence everywhere. The grocery store became a symphony of suppressed sighs. Restaurants thundered with things not being said. Even libraries, supposedly quiet, roared with the noise of thoughts being censored before they reached the page. Her own home offered no relief. She lived alone, had to, because she could hear her neighbors' marriages dissolving through the walls, not their arguments, but the specific silence of two people who've stopped trying to be heard. The couple above her had 17 different types of quiet: disappointed quiet, exhausted quiet, quiet that was actually rage compressed into diamonds. She documented them all in a journal she titled The Taxonomy of Giving Up. The worst part was her own silence. She'd stopped speaking at social gatherings because she could hear how her words landed, the little gaps where people translated what she said into something simpler, safer, smaller. Every conversation was a game of telephone where she started with complex truth and watched it degrade into comfortable lies. So she chose silence, but her silence was loud too. It screamed of judgment, of superiority, of the unbearable weight of seeing too much. One winter night, during a power outage, the city went truly quiet. No electrical hum, no traffic, no human noise. In that absolute silence, she heard something impossible. Her own thoughts without words, pure consciousness without language to shape it. It was terrifying. Without words, without the gaps between them, what was she? Just awareness, aware of itself. A mirror reflecting another mirror into infinity. Have you ever listened to yourself think? Really listened? It's not your voice you hear. She tried to explain this to her supervisor, who recommended a sabbatical. Burnout, he diagnosed, not understanding that she wasn't burnout but burn in, consumed from the inside by an intelligence that had learned to digest itself. She took the leave, but spent it conducting an experiment. How long could she go without interpreting silence? 3 days. That's how long she lasted before the compulsion returned, stronger than before. But in those 3 days, she discovered something. There was another kind of silence, not the absence of sound or the suppression of truth, but the presence of something that didn't need words. She'd felt it once, sitting with a dying patient who'd stopped trying to explain and had simply been. That silence hadn't hidden anything. It had revealed everything. The ancient mystics called it the void that speaks. Schopenhauer knew it as the will beneath representation. Modern psychology might label it semantic exhaustion. When the mind recognizes the inadequacy of all language and briefly stops trying to translate existence into words. She returned to work, but changed her practice. Instead of listening for what wasn't said, she began listening for what couldn't be said. The experience is too large or too subtle for language. Her patients noticed the difference. Sessions became quieter, but somehow fuller. She'd sit with them in their wordlessness. Not interpreting, but witnessing. Her journal evolved too. Instead of documenting types of silence, she began mapping what silence contained. The grief too deep for sound, the love too vast for vocabulary, the understanding that came not from words, but from the spaces between them. She discovered that intelligence wasn't just the ability to decode, but sometimes the wisdom to stop decoding, to let silence mean silence. The most profound conversations happen in frequencies we've trained ourselves not to hear. But here's what haunted her. Once you've heard the silence speak, you can never fully return to the comfortable noise of normal conversation. You become a translator working in both directions, converting silence to speech for those who need words, and speech back to silence for yourself, where the real meaning lives. You exist between languages, fluent in both, but native to neither. She kept a tuning fork on her desk, 440 Hz, the note orchestra's tuned to. Sometimes, when the weight of unspoken truths became unbearable, she'd strike it and listen to the pure tone, not silence, not speech, but something between, a frequency that meant nothing and everything, a sound that didn't need translation. It reminded her that intelligence wasn't just about understanding more, but sometimes about accepting what couldn't be understood, only heard. A lighthouse keeper realizes his light doesn't guide ships to safety. It shows them exactly how lost they are. Should he turn it off? Thomas had been promoted to Chief Information Officer, not for his coding skills, but for his ability to see patterns others missed. He could predict system failures weeks in advance, spot security vulnerabilities in seemingly perfect code, understand the hidden architecture of chaos that lurked beneath every ordered system. His colleagues called him prophetic. He called himself cursed. The curse was specificity. While others saw the system might crash, he saw exactly how. Which line of code would fail, which user behavior would trigger it, which cascade of errors would follow. He'd present his findings in meetings, watching eyes glaze over as he explained the 17 steps to catastrophe. They'd nod, pretend to understand, then do nothing. When the crashes came, exactly as predicted, they'd act surprised. No one could have seen this coming, they'd say, while he sat there, having seen it, described it, begged them to prevent it. He began to see his intelligence as a lighthouse, powerful, necessary, but ultimately useless if the ship's captains were blind. Worse, his light seemed to paralyze rather than guide. The more clearly he illuminated problems, the more frozen people became, overwhelmed by the complexity of what needed fixing. He learned to dim his insights, to present simplified versions that people could act on, even if those actions were incomplete. Better to prevent 30% of a disaster than to perfectly describe 100% of it while everyone stood paralyzed. His apartment reflected this paradox. One room was chaos, servers humming, screens displaying real-time data feeds, algorithms tracking patterns in everything from weather to stock markets to social media sentiment. The other room was completely empty, except for a single chair facing a window. He'd sit there for hours, trying to unsee patterns, to experience randomness, to feel what it was like to be surprised. He never succeeded. The breaking point came during a company merger. He saw exactly how it would fail, the cultural incompatibilities, the technical debt, the cascade of resignations that would follow. He documented everything in a 200-page report that no one read. They called it unnecessarily pessimistic. The merger proceeded. Everything happened exactly as he'd predicted, except worse, because knowing hadn't prepared him for feeling it. You think knowledge is power? Try knowing exactly how everything will break and being powerless to stop it. He quit on a Tuesday, sending a final email that contained just one line. The lighthouse keeper has left the building. No one understood what he meant. He moved to an actual lighthouse, abandoned for decades, on a coast known for shipwrecks. Not to guide ships, there were no ships anymore, but to think about what guidance meant when everyone was determined to crash. There, in the rotating light that illuminated nothing but empty ocean and rocks, he finally understood Schopenhauer's deepest insight. Intelligence isn't a blessing or a curse, it's a separation. The more clearly you see, the more alone you become. Not because you choose isolation, but because clarity itself is isolating. You become the lighthouse. Tall, bright, necessary, and fundamentally apart from what you're trying to save. He started writing again, but differently. Instead of reports predicting failure, he wrote fiction, stories about systems that worked, futures that arrived gently, problems that solved themselves. They were lies, but necessary ones. A colleague who read them said they were unrealistic. Thomas laughed for the first time in years. Of course they were unrealistic. Reality was the problem. The psychological term is curse of knowledge, the inability to remember what it's like not to know something. But Schopenhauer saw it as something deeper, the burden of consciousness itself. To be intelligent is to be condemned to see connections others can't, to predict patterns others won't recognize until they're drowning in them, to be a lighthouse in a world of deliberate darkness. The clearest vision is the loneliest gift. You see everything except a way to make others see. One night during a storm, he saw lights on the water. Not ships. Ships didn't come here anymore, but small boats, fishermen who'd gotten lost. Without thinking, he lit the lighthouse for the first time in decades. The ancient mechanism groaned to life, sending its beam across the waves. The boats turned toward shore, toward safety. He watched them navigate the rocks he knew by heart, finding the narrow channel to harbor. When morning came, he found a note tucked under his door. "Thank you for the light. We couldn't see the rocks until you showed them to us." He realized then that he'd had it backwards. The lighthouse's job wasn't to show people they were lost. It was to show them the obstacles, whether they wanted to see them or not. Some would navigate around them, some would crash anyway. But the light itself was not responsible for what people did with illumination. He kept the lighthouse running after that, not every night, but during storms. Sometimes boats would come, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they'd thank him. Sometimes they'd curse him for showing them how close to disaster they'd been. He accepted all responses equally. The light didn't care about gratitude or blame. It just lit what needed to be seen. Schopenhauer would have approved. The philosopher who wrote that life was suffering also wrote that the highest ethic was compassion, not despite seeing clearly, but because of it. The intelligent suffer not from knowing too much, but from the gap between what they see and what they can communicate. The lighthouse keeper's paradox isn't whether to shine the light. It's accepting that most people will close their eyes anyway, and shining it regardless. In the end, intelligence isn't about being understood. It's about understanding that you won't be and choosing to illuminate anyway. Thomas stayed in the lighthouse for 7 more years. They found him one morning, seated at his desk, having just finished writing what would become known as The Lighthouse Keeper's Guide to Necessary Blindness, a manual for intelligent people on how to survive seeing too much. The last line read, "The light doesn't judge the darkness. It simply offers an alternative." The lighthouse still runs, automated now. Ships don't need it. They have GPS, satellite navigation, systems that make human guidance obsolete. But sometimes, on foggy nights, you can see people gathered on the shore, looking at the light rotating in its ancient pattern. They're not lost sailors. They're the intelligent, the conscious, The cursed, with clarity, coming to remember that they're not alone in their aloneness. The light doesn't guide them anywhere. It just reminds them that someone else saw the rocks too.